But nobody put them together to create the concept of creation ex nihilo until the late second century CE. I think if we had a bunch of people trying to understand it as a narrative of creation that was literal, I think there would have been a lot of head scratching. There would have been a lot of questions, and I don't think it would have the position that it has now in the Bible, where it sits at the very beginning of everything. I think the idea that the spirit can separate from deity and kind of function as an independent agent, I think that is definitely throughout the Hebrew Bible. Now, the Trinity would say it is one being and multiple different persons, where a cognitive science of religion approach would say it's one person, but a person is partable.
Hey everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with Dr. Daniel McClellan. We're going to be talking about creation ex nihilo. Is it in Genesis 1:1 or anywhere in the Bible? We're going to be talking about just his interpretation of Genesis, as well as how to translate Genesis 1:1. Dr. McClellan, how are you doing today? And can you give us a little bit about your background on the topic?
Sure, I'm doing great. Thank you, Zach. I appreciate the invitation and your time. And I'm Dan McClellan. I've got some social media accounts on TikTok and Twitter and Instagram where I go by the same moniker. I go by McClellan, a phonetic spelling of my last name, McClellan. And I have a PhD in theology and religion from Exeter University, where I wrote my dissertation on cognitive linguistics and the conceptualization of deity in the Hebrew Bible. And I revised and recently published that research as a book called Adonai's Divine Images. That is an open access book, so that's freely available through SBL Press as a PDF if anybody wants to check that out. And I currently work full time as a scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints, of which I am an active member. But on my social media, I aim to promote data over dogma and try to combat misinformation and democratize access to information about the scholarly study of the Bible and religion, which, as you can imagine, makes for a great time for all.
Of course. Okay, can you give us your general views of Genesis 1:1? Like, what is the purpose of the text?
So Genesis 1:1 is the beginning of the priestly creation account, which, according to the academic consensus, is the second of the two that were composed that we find running from Genesis 1 through 3. And Genesis 1:1, I would suggest, is an update, a correction to the earlier creation account, which runs from the second half of Genesis 2:4. So we would say Genesis 2:4b, so the second half of the verse, all the way through to the end of chapter 3. Most scholars would say that's the earlier creation account, probably written somewhere in the 7th century BCE. So this is the human being created from the dust of the earth, and Eve being created by taking one of the sides of the human, and the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And that creation story involves God having to improve on their creation. They create the human. Oh, we need somebody. We need a somebody who corresponds to them. Helpmeet is the traditional translation. Let's try some animals. Oh, that's not working. Okay, let's try Eve. And so it is a very anthropomorphic approach to creation, where God makes noise walking through the Garden of Eden. The verbs being used for create are asa, which is the generic verbal root for to do or to make, yatsar, which is a verbal root that refers to framing pottery. That's how the human is created. So it is a corporeal anthropomorphic presentation where the deity's creation requires improvements and fixing. And I would argue that the priestly creation account is trying to correct and improve on the earlier creation account by presenting a deity that is more uh, not necessarily incorporeal, but at least transcendent. And whereas Genesis 2, God creates the earth and then the heavens. In Genesis 1, God creates the heavens and then the earth. So it's a more universalized perspective. God creates by divine fiat rather than working with their hands. As soon as God creates something, it is good. So there's no need to improve upon the creation. And I see Genesis 1:1 as adopting the same formula that begins the creation account in Genesis 2:4 and also begins Genesis 5. In those two places, it says Bayom, in the day of God's creating the earth and the heavens. And Bayom is a construct phrase, in the day of, and then you have the verb for, or the should be the infinitive construct form of the verb asa. And because the priestly account is actually going to divide the creative periods up into 7 days of creation, they can't begin by saying in the day of, because there's 7 days of. And so they alter the formula a little bit. And so instead of saying bayom, they say bereshit, in the beginning of, and then they have a different verb for to create. Instead of asa, it's bara, Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz. And bara is vocalized as a finite verb, but if this is parallel to what's going on in Genesis 2:4b, it should be understood as probably an infinitive construct. And the difference there is only in the vowels. And in fact, it's the infinitive construct of the verb bara that appears in Genesis 5. And so I would suggest that we have baro in the beginning of Genesis 1:1. That's the alteration I would make to the vocalization. And Bereshit baro Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz would be a construct phrase, a temporal clause, which would, instead of being in the beginning, would be in the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, or more idiomatically in English, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And then the next verse explains the circumstances when God began to create. And this would match with the grammar of Genesis 2:4b, and would also match what's going on in Genesis 5. And I think this is supported additionally by the lack of a definite article in Bereshit at the beginning of Genesis 1:1, which is something that complicates an absolute reading of that phrase. So rather than in the beginning, it's literally in a beginning, but this is just because it's the first element in a construct phrase, and in a construct phrase, the first element, irrespective of its definiteness, cannot take a definite article. It adopts the definiteness of what follows. So I think what we have going on in Genesis 1:1 and 2 is an explanation of what the status of the heavens and the earth was when God began to create. And that introduces then the priestly creation account that is updating and correcting what had previously existed with Genesis 2:4b to the end of Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve. And I imagine that the two were co-located, put side by side as a means of just preserving both of them. They were probably originally preserved on separate scrolls, and at some point someone copied them down on the same scroll. And now we have them side by side, and so we just intuitively treat them as a one continuing narrative and try to harmonize our reading of the two. So that's the 30,000 foot, way too pedantic look at what I think is going on in Genesis 1:1.
Okay, so you said that you think that Genesis 1:1 the verb is baro. I would assume that means that you disagree with the Masoretic text.
Yes, I think that that is not a finite verb. Now, Robert Holmstead has made an argument that we can still interpret it as a finite verb and interpret the clause as an unmarked relative clause. Normally, you would have a share before the verb, but we can interpret it as an unmarked relative clause, and it would still match ultimately the same interpretation that I'm offering. But I think more than likely it was not a finite verb initially. It was probably an infinitive construct. And I'm going to check real quick and just verify that that's exactly what's going on. Yeah, B'yom baro Elohim Adam bidmut Elohim asa oto. So in the day that God created Adam. So that's the exact same construction. Only instead of Bayom, we have Bereshit. So the infinitive construct is the same, and there's no change in the consonants. The only change would be in the vocalization, which was something that was not marked until we get into late antiquity and the medieval period with the Masoretic vocalization system.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. If you're going to say that it was changed, I would say that most scholars would say that the Masoretic text was pretty accurate. There's only a few places where they got it wrong, essentially. Um, what would you say is like the biggest reason is just the parallelism in the text, or what else? What is it?
I think the parallelism is the reason I would prefer revocalizing bara over interpreting Genesis 1:1 according to Robert Homestead's idea of an unmarked relative clause. I think that the temporal reading of the verse is to be preferred either way, just because there's no definite article, and creation ex nihilo, as we'll talk about, is something that I think does not come for several centuries. And so I don't see a reason to try to interpret this as this absolute the beginning. And yeah, the Masoretic text is phenomenally accurate and is phenomenally well preserved, but I don't think that their vocalizations are inviolable. I think many scholars would point out the Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls, have helped us to see many different readings that depart from the readings understood by the Masoretic text, not just in the vocalization, but in the consonants as well. And the Masoretic text also has a number of Ketiv Kare differences that indicate what they had preserved, even they understood, was probably not what was intended by the original authors. I think if you flip through a BHS, you see Carre readings in the margin on pretty much every page, and I think that's a recognition that even they were aware the text as we have it is not what was intended when it left the pen of the original authors.
Very fascinating. Okay, so what would you say is the consensus on how to translate Genesis 1:1?
Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
Wait, they have to subscribe and click a bell now?
I think we're reaching the point within the last 10 years. I think the balance has shifted to favoring the temporal reading. That is what the Jewish Publication Society, Tanakh, that's how they render Genesis 1:1. It's how Robert Alter, in his recent translation of the Hebrew Bible, renders it. The NRSV offers that as an alternative, although someone has talked about them moving that into the main body of text in the recent edition, but I haven't looked at
Yeah,
that.
the updated edition. Yeah.
Did they do that?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So there you go. I think that is indicative of a shift in the scholarly consensus. That's probably within the last decade is when I think it's really bubbled primarily to the surface, and I think that corresponds as well to the growing consensus that creation ex nihilo is a product of the 2nd century of the Common Era, rather than something that goes all the way back to the priestly creation account in the 6th or 5th century BCE.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, let's get into that. So, obviously, that's going to sound like a little crazy to some people. Like, where exactly does that come from? How do you even come to that conclusion that at a certain point it goes from no creation ex nihilo to a whole bunch of people taking that view?
The recent shift in the consensus, or how it originally developed.
Originally developed, yeah.
Yeah, there are not a ton of authors directly addressing the concept, because it is a bit of a philosophical concept. It's not something your average lay person, and today we'd say in the pews, but anciently, whatever they were using on the bench, that's not the kind of thing that they're focused on. It's something that philosophically minded folks are focused on, and so we see it addressed to some degree by folks like Philo and Paul. And then it's really picked up in the nature of creation, not the concept of creation ex nihilo itself. Justin Martyr and Tertullian and others in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. And so the what most people would just assume is that the matter has been around forever. And in every other creation account that we can find from ancient Southwest Asia all the way up to the 2nd century CE, it represents creation as something that involved existing matter, and specifically some kind of chaotic matter. And creation was conceptualized for the most part as bringing order, form, and function to matter that is chaotic, whether it is the waters of chaos or some other kind of material substrate. And this is true of Greco-Roman philosophical frameworks as well. And so in some of the writings from the 1st century BCE into the 1st century CE, like Philo, you have some people talking about the existence of matter from which God created the universe. And the conventional wisdom at the time within Greek philosophy, anyway, was that nothing comes from nothing. Now, you do have some terminology that is used in places like 2nd Maccabees 7:28. So the story of the mother and her 7 sons. There's the mother is exhorting one of the sons to not give in to Antiochus and to die with honor, and talks about the God having created everything not from things that are. And the Greek there is uk ex onton, literally not from the being or what exists. And from a contemporary point of view, that seems an awful lot like creation ex nihilo, but it is actually kind of a standard reference to a widely accepted basic philosophical framework that is used to refer to, in Xenophon, for instance, how parents create children, not from what exists, but from what is non-being. And according to this framework, matter can either exist in a state of non-being or in a state of being. And if it is non-being, then it does not have form or function. To move it into being is to give it form and function. And so what's going on in 2nd Maccabees is most scholars would say today is a reflection of that kind of standard conventional wisdom that matter goes from a state of non-being to a state of being. And we see this in the Shepherd of Hermas. It's probably what's going on in Romans as well. We don't really get a clear articulation of the idea of matter coming from nothing until the 2nd century CE. And this is within the context of debates with Gnostics and with others about the morality of matter, because Gnostics are adopting this Platonic idea that the material world is corrupt and is base and low, and the spiritual immaterial world is the higher world. And so we are spirit and matter, and when the matter dies, the spirit will ascend to heaven, back to divinity. And so matter is seen as corrupt and evil, and that's something that the Gnostics pick up and develop it in a variety of different ways. But early Christians are debating with them and other Greek thinkers based on the rationality of the resurrection. Well, the resurrection is going to involve some kind of matter. So how can we have these eternal bodies that are in some sense participating in divinity if it's matter? And then, what kind of sense does resurrection make if our bodies have disintegrated? And the argument comes to a head in the late 2nd century CE, and we finally get this idea, you know what? God can create out of nothing, and the creation of the earth becomes kind of a conceptual template or parallel to resurrection, where just like God can create the earth out of nothing, God can resurrect the human body from nothing, because it's been disintegrated, consumed by animals and plants and people and stuff like that. And so that's when we get the first real clear articulation of this. And it's also involved in discussions about the uniqueness of God, this idea that God exists apart from all other reality, and God is the creator of all other reality. And if there was some eternally existing material that existed alongside God, then that represents a kind of dualism. And so monotheism, which is another later developed philosophical construct, is complicated by the idea of eternally existing matter. And so, in order to get to monotheism, we first had to get to the idea that God created all that exists and it had to have come from nothing, which was directly rejecting the overwhelming consensus among thinkers at that time period that nothing can come from nothing. So it's quite a philosophical innovation on the part of early Christian thinkers, and the building blocks, the conceptual building blocks of it, were probably around into the first century BCE, but nobody put them together to create the concept of creation ex nihilo until the late second century CE, and it was not fully articulated in the way we still understand it today until even a few centuries after that. And there was actually a really good book that was published just a couple years ago on precisely this topic that I've recommended to some folks. So it's from 2018, Gary Anderson and Marcus Bachmuel, Creation ex Nihilo, Origins, Development, Contemporary Challenges. And it takes a little more conservative approach than I do, but I think it offers a lot of good data on the development of the concept.
Very interesting. So just a really short way to sum that up would be to say that, it wasn't the original view. And then, these Gnostics come around and the Christians were like, oh, we don't want to be like these Gnostics. So we got to change how we think about it. Is that a good way to put it?
I think that's a part of it. I think as Christian theology is developing, there are a lot of different factors going into their theological frameworks, and certainly part of it was, well, what are these guys saying over here? We've got to have a response to this, and we've got to, they can't be right. So that's a part of it, but I don't think that would be the only thing. I highlight that as one of the clearest factors, but this was. Developing Christian theology was something a lot of people were engaged in for a lot of different reasons. And so that wasn't the only factor, but certainly I think that was one of the deciding factors.
Very fascinating. Okay. So you mentioned Romans 4. Well, I would assume it was Romans 4:17. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. So the text says, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Now, a lot of people are going to say, okay, that's definitely creation ex nihilo. Can you give us your little rundown of, I guess, why you don't think so, and I guess why other scholars don't think so as well?
So that's using another version of this turn of phrase, the mi onta. So in Second Maccabees, it's uk ex onton, not from what is, and this is mi onta. So this is not being things, also in the plural, but it's not in the genitive. At least I don't think it's in the genitive. No, I think it's in the accusative. But this is another example of this Greek turn of phrase where you referred to things that did not have form and function as non-being, mionta or uk onta, and then to apply form and function to them is to move them from the realm of non-being into the realm of being. And this is something that would fit well within Paul's the philosophical frameworks that were influential on Paul. And so what's a good translation of this? Summons the things that do not yet exist as though they already do. I think it's calling the things not being as being. So this is God's foreknowledge. The things that are not yet having form and function, God is referring to them as if they do have form and function. So in discussions I have with people about the Bible's position on abortion, they'll talk about Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. This would be referring to something that was mi onta, as if it was onta, something that not yet being as if it was being. So there are probably around the turn of the around 2000, I think, is where the tide shifted. In the 80s and 90s, there were a bunch of debates about creation ex nihilo, where this passage, Second Maccabees, Shepherd of Hermas, and a couple others were kind of brought up as the proof text for creation ex nihilo prior to what Gerhard May said was the creation of this doctrine in the late 2nd century. And I think most scholars today would say, no, these probably all are reflecting that conventional wisdom about matter either having non-being or having being. But there are still folks who will debate this. Marcus Bachmuel published, in addition to that book, he also published a paper a bit ago on first century Jewish concepts of creation ex nihilo, and was trying to get as close as he could to identifying creation ex nihilo in the 1st century, but ultimately said it's not articulated. The motivations are there. The the conceptual frameworks are all there, but it's just not articulated until later.
Very fascinating. Okay, so of course you're gonna have a lot of people that say, all right, so maybe it was just lost throughout the centuries, but it wasn't the original Genesis 1 text, or maybe even Genesis 2 and 3, all that kind of stuff. Why? What about Genesis 1 and 2 makes you think that it couldn't be about creation ex nihilo?
I think that the idea of creation ex nihilo would within ancient Israel, within Greco-Roman period Judaism, within all these contexts, that would have been a remarkable departure from the conventional wisdom. And so it would have been something that would have needed to be spread and even to some degree enforced. New and different ideas don't just take hold very easily without articulation and repetition and things like that. And so to find no observation that stands at odds with everything that's going on around them uh, makes it seem like this is not bucking the trend. It is actually adopting a lot of the frameworks from the broader world of ancient Southwest Asian cosmogony. We're borrowing stuff from Mesopotamia in Genesis 1. And for the most part, we're kind of directly responding to it and challenging it. We have, rather than fighting a chaos uh, monster in Tiamat, we've just got the Tehom is just inert and is just there, and God just acts upon it by divine fiat. So where we're challenging their frameworks, it comes through pretty clearly in the text. But there's nothing in the text that requires or even points in the direction of a reading of creation ex nihilo until you have the concept of creation ex nihilo, and then you can read it into the text. But the text on its own doesn't point in that direction at all. And even the idea, even if an absolute reading, if you say in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, you still got a few verses to go before God actually creates the earth. So we're going back to the start. Was the beginning just kind of an introduction? Was it a chapter heading? Why did God create the heavens and the earth in the beginning, but then created a bunch of other stuff before getting back around to creating the earth? There are a bunch of questions I don't think a creation ex nihilo reading of Genesis 1 has answers to. I mean, people can rationalize it, but if you try to approach it without presupposing these things, it's you don't get to that answer. The text doesn't lead you to that answer unless you know you already want to get there. So I recognize that that's an approach to the text a lot of folks who want to find creation ex nihilo there aren't interested in taking, because the text is has a different function for them, a theological function, and to have excuse me, to have it challenge a lot of their theological presuppositions, I think is a set of interpretive lenses they're not incredibly eager to apply.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so I mean, if it's not creation ex nihilo, then a lot of people are going to ask, okay, like what is it? I mean, is it? It was already there was already matter there. Is God just like get some hands together, forming it and moving it around? Is that all it is, or can you describe us more what you think is happening on the days?
Yeah, I think that well, the earlier account, which is Genesis 2, I think we've got this earth that is it's dirt. There's not a lot going on until God provides the water, which is what is needed in order to bring things to life. And so that would be this concept of an earth existing, but there's no living things on it. That's a different um, starting point than I think what we have in the Priestley account, which I think sees everything as watery chaos. And the creative acts are processes of separating light from darkness, separating water from land, separating the waters above from the waters below. And we have 6 main creative periods. And if you look at periods 1, 2, and 3, they correspond to periods 4, 5, and 6, where the first 3 represent the creation of the environments, and then the second 3 represent the creation of the inhabitants of the environments. So you have light and dark on day 1. On day 4, you have the celestial bodies that inhabit the light and the dark, the sun during the day, the moon and the stars at night. Then you have the waters above from the waters below, and you have the birds that fly through the air, which is kind of among the waters that are suspended above, and then the fish in the sea, and you have the dry land, and then day 6 you have the animals that inhabit the dry land. And so this is organized more poetically than progressively. And I think that's how we can account for, saying it was evening and it was day, and we don't even have a sun yet, because it's a poetic framing of these creative periods, where first you create the environments and then you create the inhabitants. So it's ordered, it's poetic, it's not progressive, but it is operating on initially chaotic waters, which in a lot of ways reflects what's going on in some of the Mesopotamian creation accounts at Numa Elish, for instance. But rather than personify this chaos as this dragon Tiamat, whose corpse is split in two to create the heavens and the earth, it is just inert, chaotic water that God speaks to and by divine fiat separates. There was an interesting paper published 13 years ago, I think, by Ellen Van Wold, who is a cognitive linguist, who talked about understanding the verbal root bara as having to do primarily with separating or distinguishing, and using that as a framework for looking at the creation account and how everything is a process of creation. Unfortunately, a lot of people responded very negatively to that article, but I think there's value in how she suggested we conceptualize what was going on with that verb.
Yeah, much appreciated. So, I mean, to get into more detail, I mean, do you think that you said the word poetically a few times. So you don't think that they literally, like the typical Israelite thought that God literally took some light and darkness, split into, the chaotic water, split that into, you don't think that's what literally happened?
I think this was probably a liturgical account. So there are different ways to kind of scholarly understand in a scholarly way what was going on with these creation accounts. The earlier creation account might have been a liturgical account that was used in a New Year's festival in the temple, where you kind of reify the reorganization of the heavens and the earth at the beginning of the new year, so that it can carry out all the necessary functions over the cycle of the next year. And I think the priestly account may be doing something very similar, whether it was composed in the absence of the temple or after the second temple had already been created. But one of the things that I think suggests it may be done in the absence of a temple is the fact that the 7 days of creation, with the seventh day being a day of rest, is some scholars see as a means of, in the absence of a official sacred space, carving out sacred time so that God can be worshipped. We don't have sacred space in which to do it, so let's create sacred time and use that time in which to engage in our worship. And so the 7 days of creation may be a means of conceptualizing this cosmic temple, where instead of going into a specific space to worship God, we set aside this day to worship God. And so if it's being used this way, as liturgically, I think it probably would have been performed in some kind of setting where people weren't thinking, well, how did we have an evening and a morning if we didn't have the sun yet? I think that wasn't what it was focused on. And so I imagine there were people who probably were like, well, that doesn't make much sense, but that's not what we're here for. We're here for either the performing this liturgy so that the cosmic order will be maintained for the cycle of the next year. So I think that's one way to account for uh, how they may have thought about this account. I think if we had a bunch of people trying to understand it as a narrative of creation that was literal, I think there would have been a lot of head scratching. There would have been a lot of questions, and I don't think it would have the position that it has now in the Bible, where it sits at the very beginning of everything. So, that's my personal opinion, though. I know there are different different opinions from different folks on that.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, I think you made a strong case either way, but to those that not totally convinced yet, so you have days 4 and 6 where you say, that's kind of like filling the space. Now, to a lot of people, it seems like, all right, you've got the sun, moon, and stars. They're not mentioned, and then all of a sudden they're mentioned, and then you have the animals. They're not mentioned, and they're mentioned, and then the humans. They're not mentioned, and they're mentioned, and it's almost like, all right, well, the text doesn't say where they came from, so it seems like they weren't there. They didn't exist, and now then they exist all of a sudden. So, like, I mean, obviously, you see an issue with that. Like, why don't you think that specifically is creation ex nihilo?
Let me pull up the text real quick. There are sometimes when the text is "let there be" or something like that, which, yeah, you can understand that to refer to creation from nothing, but I mean, it's not necessary. It's not impossible to interpret that as "let all this stuff become." And the verb there is haya, which can mean to be or to become. And you've got let me pull it up, because it talks about let the land produce vegetation. And I think it talks about the waters bringing forth. Let there be lights in the sky. Okay, so that's day 4. Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. So let the land produce living creatures. What is the verb there? Okay, Vayomer Elohim totsei haaretz. So that is yatsa. Let these things come out, or cause to go out. So for some of this explicitly, you have let this material generate these things rather than just let these things be. But to say that let it be requires creation ex nihilo is to say that no one could say those words prior to the creation ex nihilo. In the absence of creation ex nihilo, no one could use the verb create or say, let something be, because that would necessitate, would require that concept of creation ex nihilo. But that kind of language is found in other texts, in other societies that never developed a concept of creation ex nihilo. So to say that that language suggests that, I think is going a little bit too far, because that means the language cannot suggest anything else. But that language is found in a bunch of places that don't ever suggest creation ex nihilo. So I think that's a preferential reading rather than a reading that is required or necessary or most likely.
So, in other words, it's a possibility. The text isn't specifically clear in that specific instance, but you've got a whole bunch of other evidence to think that it's not talking about that. Is that right?
I think so. I'm as a cognitive linguist, I like to talk about how texts don't say anything. Texts have no inherent meaning. They don't mean anything until we impose some kind of interpretive lens on them to generate meaning. And the meaning always and only resides in the minds of a reader or viewer or hearer or something like that. And because the generation of that meaning is dependent on experiences and understandings of agreements about what sounds and combinations of sounds will be indexing what semantic content, there are always a number of different possibilities. And so it's common for folks to assert the interpretation that feels the best to them, that resonates the most with their own worldview, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right reading, um, because the folks who wrote this were writing, one, in a different language, two, in a vastly different society, three, thousands of years ago. And so their experiences and the agreements that they understood regarding relationships between combinations of sounds and semantic content could be vastly different from our own. And so I think too frequently, not just do we kind of argue in support of our theological preferences, but too frequently uh, we assert readings because they resonate with us and because they make sense to us. And just because something doesn't make sense to us doesn't mean it couldn't make sense to the original author. And so the challenge is to try to reproduce the interpretive frameworks and the context and the circumstances to the best of our ability that coincided with the production of the text anciently, so we can try to see what may have made the most sense to them. And that is fraught with difficulties and can never be perfectly accurate. So it's always just a rough approximation. But I think when we allow what makes sense to us to govern, we get ourselves into the most trouble.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's kind of change subjects here. So you've got a very specific view of, I guess, the Trinity, or maybe you won't even call it that. Could you describe your view of that?
Yeah. So in the book that I just published, I talked a little about this, and I have a paper that I published in 2018 in the Journal of Biblical Interpretation. But I think what the Trinity is doing is creating a single philosophical framework for understanding Jesus's relationship to God. But in the New Testament, we have different authors presenting different perspectives on Jesus's relationship to God. And I think trying to synthesize all of those to produce a single perspective or framework is a fallacy that presupposes univocality, presupposes all these different authors and texts are actually working with the same perspective and just different angles on that same framework and understanding. And I don't think that that fits with the data. And so a lot of the research that I've been doing in trying to understand the nature of deity is trying to understand what they thought about when they thought about deity anciently, and what they and that led to a lot of research on personhood. And so I see in the New Testament, different authors presenting different ideas about Jesus's relationship with God that strike me as very, very similar to the ways that folks are trying to understand the relationship of divine images to the deities that they index, and the relationship of the angel of the Lord to God in the Hebrew Bible. And using cognitive linguistics and the cognitive science of religion, I produced a theoretical framework for understanding the logic of divine images. and what this boils down to is basically that a divine image was perceived as a material channel or an index for the presence of a deity. And there's a modern parallel to this. We do the same thing today. We don't think of it as the same thing. But if you've ever seen a movie, watched a TV show, done it yourself, where someone has gone to a cemetery and spoken to the headstone of a deceased loved one as if they're speaking to their deceased loved one, that's a manifestation, I have argued, of the same logic, that this is a material index for the presence or the agency of this individual, the deceased loved one or the deity. And this in my book, it gets a little complex, but it gets down to conceptualizations of personhood and relationships between agency and parts of the body and how they're separable and how they're permeable. And that's more than we need to get into today. But in short, anciently, they conceptualized of divine images as kind of material media that could be inhabited by or that could channel the agency, the authority, the power, the presence of a deity. And this is then how I argue the angel of the Lord is understood. We have some passages where the angel of the Lord seems to have their identity conflated with God themselves. With Hagar in Genesis 16, with Abraham in Genesis 22, with Moses in Exodus 3, with Gideon in Judges 6, with Manoach and his wife in Judges 13. In all of those passages, you see a person who thinks they're talking to God, but the narrative describes them alternatively talking to God or talking to the angel of the Lord. And so the identities get a little mixed up there. And I argue that originates in textual interpolation. But later on, when in Exodus, when God is going to lead the folks out of Egypt, part of the text, God says, "I will send my angel before you to guide you along the way. Pay attention to him. Do not disobey him, because he does not have to forgive your sins because my name is in him." And the idea here, I argue, is that this is a way to account for how we can have the confusion of identities between the angel and God themselves. And that is that the angel bears the divine name, is the authorized bearer of the divine name. And because of that, can reify the presence or manifest the presence of the deity, can identify with the deity, and can exercise the deity's power. That's why the angel has the power to forgive or not forgive sins. So fast forward to the New Testament, we have this individual who, Jesus, who is the bearer of the divine name. According to Philippians 2, God has endowed Jesus with the name that is above all other names, and scholars overwhelmingly agree this is the divine name. In the Gospel of John, you have a number of ways that Jesus invokes the divine name and identifies with the divine name. And if we recognize that the divine name functions as an independent vehicle of divine agency rather than as isometric with the deity themselves, for Jesus to invoke the divine name is not for Jesus to identify as God, but to assert possession of the divine name, this communicable vehicle for divine agency. And so this is the intuitive underpinning of what's going on in the New Testament, I argue. Just like folks who speak to headstones may not all rationalize what they're doing, may not think rationally about what they're doing, but they are motivated by the same intuitive cognitive impulse. So Jesus, as basically a divine image, a sentient divine image, is intuitively understood in the same way. And then you have the authors who are coming up with different frameworks for this. So Mark has kind of a adoptionist approach to this. John adopts almost an emanation theology for this. There's a sense in which Paul adopts kind of an angelomorphic, treats Jesus as this name-bearing angel, and that's Paul Holloway has made a good argument in his Hermeneia commentary on Philippians that Paul is treating Jesus as a name-bearing angel. And so, in short, I know I've said a lot of stuff that probably doesn't make a ton of sense, but in short, uh, when the New Testament was being written, Jesus was adopting this conceptual template of the name-bearing angel. That's not to say that Jesus was an angel, but that they looked at the angel and said, let's develop this further with the Jesus tradition. And it's adopting some of the ideas from Greco-Roman period Judaism about mediator figures, the Son of Man. YHWH talks about exercising God's power because of the divine name that he bears in the Apocalypse of Abraham. You have Metatron in Second Enoch, very similarly talking about the divine name. In First Enoch, the Son of Man is endowed with the divine name, and that's what is going to facilitate everyone on earth bowing down and worshiping and singing hymns of praise to the Son of Man. So this is all kind of consolidated within the Jesus tradition, and Christ becomes the ultimate bearer of the divine name. And then once all the texts of the New Testament are written and brought together and treated as a single corpus, well, now you have to systematize it. You have to distill it all down and synthesize it into a single theory. And with the rise of the second century apologists, who are, in a sense, trying to make the gospel more palatable to the Greco-Roman intelligentsia, I think that's when you get these philosophical frameworks brought to bear on the question, and it all has to be reduced to a single framework, which is not worked out till the 4th and 5th century, but which becomes the Trinity. And that process is a whole nother story that that we'll save for another day.
Very fascinating. Okay, so this is not something I planned on asking you, but question: do you think that affects, typical views of like how Jesus, quote unquote, died for our sins and all that kind of stuff?
I think that depends on one's kind of theory of atonement. There are a bunch of different models for how the atonement can work, and those took, in many cases, centuries to work out. And so the approach that I for which I advocate and argue in my book, and I have another book that I'm writing where I'll flesh this out even further. Yeah, that's not going to resonate with most people's theories of atonement, but that does not necessarily mean that it cannot be negotiated with. I think all theology is ultimately a negotiation between the sacred past that we inherit, whether through text or tradition or liturgy or whatever, and our needs and our circumstances today. Because if we adopt a theology from the past that informed experiences in the past that are no longer the experiences that we have today, then that theology is not relevant. And so in order to make it relevant to today, there's a negotiation that has to take place. And so, yeah, this is something that is different and would require a negotiation if someone were going to adopt it for actual theological purposes. That's not the reason I'm coming up with it. It's a scholarly framework, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of arguing with folks who do take a more theological approach to things, but it's not something that's non-negotiable, I think, in the end.
That makes sense. Okay, I appreciate you explaining that. So, just to be clear, so the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, not Jesus.
I think that it is not. It was definitely not understood as Jesus by anyone in the time period of the composition of the Hebrew Bible. I think that reading Jesus into the text was a part of early Christianity's development of this idea that Jesus is this name-bearing agent. But I think it developed beyond that the Son of Man tradition was not angelic in orientation, but what we had was a bunch of streams of tradition coming together, and then that was coming together within the Jesus tradition. And so you have the influence of the angel of the Lord, and then you don't get Jesus read back into the angel of the Lord until later on, when you've got these more theological debates about the relationship of Jesus to what's going on in the Old Testament. And I think a lot of that had to do with the argument, the anti-anthropomorphic debates of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century CE, which is where in the Bible God is thoroughly anthropomorphic and is only starting to kind of become transcendent in a way that complicates corporeality and anthropomorphism. And so it's in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE that you get these problems with, well, if God is material, then that means all these things. Okay, well, let's take God as immaterial. And then we look at the text, well, that problematizes all these things. And so that's part of that negotiation. And a wonderful book on that is God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavrokopoulou, my dissertation supervisor. Talks a great deal about the corporeal anthropomorphic nature of the deity throughout the Hebrew Bible, and what things led to the undermining of that conceptualization of deity. And I think that plays into why people looked into the text and were like, oh, that's not God, that's not the angel of God, that's got to be Jesus.
That's fascinating. I didn't know you had these connections with her, so that's cool.
Yeah, I had dinner with her just a few weeks ago.
Oh wow,
I
what a
was
blessing.
I was in England on the way to Malta for work, and decided to go out to Exeter and had a wonderful time.
That's cool. Okay, so we've kind of fleshed out your view of, Jesus, the Trinity, whatever that is. Let's talk about. So you wouldn't say that the Trinity is in Genesis 1, um, like, but you have mentions of like the Spirit, and some people would say that's like the Holy Spirit, or you have the "let us" language, and then also you have like a Elohim, and all throughout Genesis 1, a lot of people like it has the plural ending, so it's like, oh, is that plural gods, or maybe that's the Trinity in general. Like, what would you say are your thoughts on whether we have some type of Trinity in the Genesis 1:1?
So I think when we're talking about the Spirit, that is one of these separable elements of divine personhood. So to the degree that the Trinity is about divisions in personhood, I think the idea that the Spirit can separate from deity and kind of function as an independent agent, I think that is definitely throughout the Hebrew Bible. But I think my framework makes the best sense of that, this idea of personhood as partible and as permeable. Now, the Trinity would say it is one being and multiple different persons, where a cognitive science of religion approach would say it's one person, but a person is partible. You can have parts of your personhood separated from you, and they can be independent loci of agency. And so an example of this, and that could manifest the presence of the person. So a good example of this is uh, people have done research on how different societies talk about the person, and across a bunch of societies that have been studied, pretty consistently, the location of the person or their agency, the seat of their agency, is located either in the heart, in the bowels, the guts, or a combination of the heart and the head. And so the heart becomes a symbol of the person, and it becomes a separable part of the person. We are an assemblage of parts, and they can be separated and they can also be permeated. And so an example of this is Saul's call to become king. And I think it's 1 Samuel 9 and 10, where Samuel tells Saul that God's spirit, in most translations, it says will overcome you, but the verbal root there can also mean to penetrate. God's spirit will penetrate you, in other words, permeate you, and give you a new heart, and you will become a different person. And so this is a reflection of the Hebrew Bible's anthropology, which understands the heart to be constitutive, or as I prefer to pronounce it, constitutive of personhood. And in the Hebrew Bible, the mind is nothing; the brain is irrelevant. Everything's in the heart and or in the bowels. And so we have ways that the heart is constitutive of personhood today too. And a story that I think is kind of dramatic, but shows this is there's a story about a young man who needed a heart transplant, and he got a heart when a 20-year-old woman died in a car accident. And the woman's father rode his bike across the country to meet this man. And when they met, he had a stethoscope with him and listened to his heartbeat, and he wept. And he said he was so happy that his daughter could help keep this man alive. And then he said, and I got to spend time with my daughter. And that is a reflection of this intuitive perception that the heart constitutes, reifies, manifests the person's presence. And so that's an example of that locus of personhood, of presence, separating from the rest of the person's body and then being permeating another person's body, but still manifesting that person's presence. And this wasn't just a turn of phrase. This guy wasn't just being poetic. He wept when he heard the heartbeat, because that was a visceral manifestation of what he knew to be a part of his daughter that was still living. And so it made him feel the presence of his daughter. And so I think that there are ways in the Hebrew Bible that we have these parts of deity that can be separable. And the name is one of them. The Spirit is another one of them. The Chokhmah, the wisdom of God, is another one of these separable loci of agency that can take on a degree of independence and even a degree of personhood. Particularly in Proverbs, the wisdom becomes personified as this woman: I was created before the mountains and the seas and things like that. And so the Spirit also becomes personified in some ways, particularly as you get into the Greco-Roman period and into the New Testament. But in Genesis 1, the Spirit is definitely an agent of some kind. The plural language is different. The "let us make," you see this in Genesis 1. You see this in Genesis 3:22. So the serpent tells Eve, "You will not surely die. You will be like the gods, knowing good and evil." And then that's verse 5. And then in 22, turns out the serpent was right, was not lying, was perfectly accurate, because the deity says, and I forget it's the singular or the plural, but the human has become like one of us. And we're talking about plural deities here. So this isn't the Trinity, because it's not a reference to a single being who is constituted by three different persons. This is a reference to multiple deities. You also have the same cohortative or first person plural references in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. Let us go down. Now, this is not just because Elohim is plural. Elohim is grammatically plural, but it can refer to either a singular or a plural entity, referent. And this is because I think the theoretical framework that makes the most sense to me is one developed, I think, in the year 2000. There's a book, and he's going to be upset with me, but I forget his name off the top of my head. A Reassessment of Biblical Elohim by Joel Burnett, where he talks about, traditionally we talk about a plural of majesty, but that doesn't make sense, because we also have pejorative terms that have singular reference when they're grammatically plural. And people have come up with this idea of, oh, well, that's the plural of humility. It's the exact same thing, but it's the opposite of how they label it. So plural of majesty doesn't make a ton of sense. But what Joel argues is that this was an abstract plural. So the idea was God in the singular, use the abstract plural to refer to the abstraction, divinity, but that is used so frequently in reference to specific instantiations of deity that it becomes concretized. And so the abstract plural can be used in reference to single reference. And there are other words where this happens as well, where the abstract plural becomes concretized. So he refers to Elohim as a concretized abstract plural. So it can mean either deity or deities or divine. And you know which one it is based on the verbs and the pronouns. So Genesis 1:1 says, Bara Elohim. That's singular. Elohim is singular. So it cannot be interpreted as created the gods. It has to be just God created. Now in 126, you have the cohortative, the first person plural. So this doesn't have Elohim as the subject explicitly. So there's nothing to interpret in the plural there. But this, most scholars agree, is a vestigial reference to the divine council. the idea that all the actions that God takes on earth are deliberated within this council. And we see this reflected all throughout the Hebrew Bible, and even to some degree in later literature. And so let us create mankind or humanity. This is God talking to the divine council, but then God themselves goes down to do it. The human has become like one of us. This is God talking to the divine council. Let us go down and see what they're building down there. This is God talking to the divine council. And they're probably just remnants of these, stories from earlier periods. But we see the divine council in a number of places. Psalm 82, probably the most famous one. But most of the time, where you have a plural imperative, witness, hear, give ear, where they're not talking to someone specific, but maybe talking to celestial bodies, or maybe just not talking to anyone that's specified, that's usually divine council speak. This is God telling the other deities to witness, hear, give ear, things like that. So that's what is most likely going on with the plurals there. Not every single time you see Elohim in the plural can you understand it in the plural. If it's a singular verb, you've got to understand Elohim as a singular usage. But if it's a plural verb, then yes, you have to understand it in the plural, and that complicates some things, because in Genesis, I forget the passage, when Abraham says, God caused me to wander from my home, but the verb there is plural. The most accurate translation would be the gods caused me to wander. And scholars say, oh, well, he's talking to a pagan, so he's just trying to, meet him on the same playing field. Maybe. That's certainly possible. And it's also possible that this is a remnant from an earlier story where there are multiple gods. So there are a couple instances where you have Elohim with plural verbs, and translators have long kind of looked the other way at that, but that's the clearest indicator of whether Elohim is plural or singular. And the Trinity is not something that was ever found in these texts until they developed the concept of the Trinity, and had to go try to make sense of passages that had long troubled early Jewish and Christian readers, because by the time of the New Testament, the idea of the divine council had been renegotiated down to the point where it was angels. And so they referred to them as gods from time to time, but that was just kind of an aspect of the text that most people overlooked. And even scholars do that today. I find this funny. Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, even Justin Martyr, the Hebrew Bible, angels are referred to as gods, but scholars never say gods. They always say subordinate divine beings, semi-divine beings. It's never a god, because that complicates that grates against theological sensitivities, but it is verbatim what they referred to them as in the Bible, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a bunch of other literature. So I kind of have to giggle when somebody says semi-divine beings, subordinate divine beings, angelic beings, things like that.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. That is all I have for you. I really appreciate your thoughts, and we'll put answers.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, sure. Dr. McClellan, so you have your TikTok. You mentioned these before. You have your YouTube. Those will be in the description. Is there anywhere else, you have your class coming up? What else?
Not too much else. I'm working on a book right now, but I do have, this is the book that I just published through SBL Press, Adonai's Divine Images, A Cognitive Approach. You can get hard copies if you're interested in one, but it's also freely available as a PDF. And so if you find one of my social media accounts, I have Linktree in the bios of all my social media accounts, and you can find a link directly to a PDF of my book if you'd like to check that out, where I make a more thorough and probably a lot more comprehensible argument for what I've been talking about tonight.
All right, much appreciated, Dr. McClellan. This has been awesome. I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thank you. You too. I appreciate it.
Yes, of course.